I once had 2 job interviews in Georgia. At the time, I lived in Boston. To save some cash, I decided to drive down instead of flying. My job back then was terrible, and the 2 interviews I had lined up, well, they could be my escape. Both were high-paying, corporate gigs with solid benefits. And frankly, the warmer weather down there was a nice bonus. It was Friday night when I hit the road. I had taken the whole weekend off, hoping to get these interviews out of the way. After a long day at work, I stopped by my apartment to grab my suitcase, said goodbye to a few friends, and set off. It was going to be a long haul, about an 11-hour drive. My estimated arrival 3 a.m. I had booked a room at a Comfort Inn. I downed 3 cups of coffee in the first few hours, thinking it would keep me sharp. But when you're already dead tired, no amount of caffeine can fight that. I hadn't slept much the night before, too busy stressing over these interviews. And after a long, exhausting day, the last thing I wanted was an all-night drive. By the time it was 1 a.m., I was barely hanging on. The highway was empty, a few scattered headlights here and there, but mostly just me, the road, and the darkness. I was fighting to keep my eyes open. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, wearing a suit. He wasn't walking, wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. As I passed, his head turned to follow my car, but I brushed it off, made up stories in my head to keep from falling asleep. Maybe he'd been dumped by someone. Maybe his car broke down. Anything to keep myself alert. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another man, in a suit, standing by the road staring at me as I drove by. This time, I slowed down, pulling over to the shoulder. I thought about offering him a ride. I know it sounds stupid, but I wasn't thinking straight. I was exhausted. But when I looked back, when I turned around, the man was gone. Just disappeared. I pulled into a gas station, grabbed a medium coffee, and sat there in the parking lot, trying to shake the feeling. Then I saw him again, standing under a streetlight. Same suit, same face, staring at my car. I slammed the car into reverse and got out of there, without even glancing back. The coffee wasn't working anymore. I felt like I was on the edge of passing out. I wasn't going to make it to the hotel. I pulled into a random parking lot, laid my seat back, and closed my eyes, hoping to get just a little sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the man in the suit, standing. I must have drifted off for a minute, but something jolted me awake. I looked around, terrified, half expecting to see him standing outside the car. I checked every window. Nothing. But then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw him, in the back seat. I screamed, kicked the door open, and scrambled out of the car. My heart was racing as I stumbled back to my feet. But when I looked inside again, the back seat was empty. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion, just mind playing tricks on me. I got back in the car, my heart pounding, too wired to sleep now. I finished the coffee and forced myself to push through the last hour of the drive. By the time I checked into the hotel, it was nearly 4 a.m. I collapsed onto the bed and sleep immediately. The next day, my first interview was at 10 a.m. I hadn't slept much, but I felt better. Until I met my interviewer. When he walked in, I froze. It was him, the man in the suit, the same face I had been seeing all night. He noticed the look on my face, and I could tell he was confused, but I couldn't recover. The entire interview was a disaster. My second interview went better, a woman this time, and I actually landed that job. I'm living in Georgia now, still working there. My old therapist said the stress of preparing for those interviews, combined with the lack of sleep, probably caused me to hallucinate. Maybe she's right. Maybe my mind created the man in the suit, because that's who I was expecting to see during the interviews. But even if it was all in my head, it doesn't change how terrifying that night was. I was driving down an empty highway, late one foggy night. The road stretched out in front of me. like a black ribbon disappearing into the void. The only light came from my headlights, and a pale crescent moon barely hanging in the sky. It was past midnight, and I was exhausted. The radio had cut out miles ago, leaving only the steady hum of the engine to keep me company. As I drove, I glanced at the gas gauge, dangerously low. I should have filled up at the last station, but I thought I could make it to the next one. Now, I wasn't so sure. The needle hovered just above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Suddenly, the car started sputtering. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, but it only made things worse. The engine gave a choking cough, and then silence. The car coasted to a stop on the side of the road. "No," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition again and again. Nothing. The engine cranked, but it refused to start. I was out of gas, stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Completely cut off. The road was deserted. Just trees, shadows, and that crushing darkness all around. I decided to stay inside the car, locking the doors. Maybe someone would pass by. Maybe my signal would come back. I didn't want to wander into the woods. Something about that night just felt creepy. Time passed slowly. I kept checking my phone. Nothing. The silence. It started to weigh on me. Only the occasional rustle of leaves broke the eerie quiet. Then, I saw it. Movement. Just at the edge of my vision. I turned my head, and a figure emerged from the trees. My heart raced. He was tall, thin, his hair matted and wild. His clothes were ragged, like he'd been living out there for days, maybe weeks. He staggered toward my car, stopping just outside my window, staring in. His eyes locked on me. A soft knock on the glass. Then louder. "Hey, let me in," he said, his voice almost desperate. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, shaking my head. No way I was letting him in. "Please, I need help." He knocked again. Harder this time, the sound echoing in the dead air. I could feel panic rising in me. What did he want? Why was he out here, and why was he staring at me like that, when I thought things couldn't get any worse? Just then, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A car, approaching. Relief washed over me. I honked the horn, trying to get their attention. The car slowed down. It was a police cruiser. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the dark. The man took a step back, his eyes darting nervously. One of the officers approached my window, shining the light inside. "Everything okay here?" he asked. I quickly unlocked the door and stepped out. "My car ran out of gas," I said. "This man, he came out of the woods and started banging on my window. I don't know what he wants." The officer turned to the man, who was now standing a few feet away, shifting nervously. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" the other officer asked, stepping closer. The man didn't answer. He just stared at them for a moment, then turned, disappearing back into the woods without a word. The officers watched him go. Then one turned to me. "You're lucky we came by," he said. "It's not safe out here at night. We'll call a tow truck and give you a ride into town." I nodded, feeling a rush of relief. As I climbed into the back of the police car, I glanced one last time at the woods. The man was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just been avoided. That night it was a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, and how easily you can find yourself facing something you were never prepared for. I used to work for a small trucking company based in Ohio, delivering frozen products to stores across several Midwest states. Most days I'd make 3 or 4 deliveries before heading back to the warehouse, and finally home. But every so often, we'd get a long route, one that ended too far from the depot to make it back the same day. When that happened, I'd have to sleep somewhere, overnight before driving home. Usually, I'd just pull into a truck stop, rest for a few hours, and get back on the road. This particular trip was one of those long-haul deliveries. I knew I wouldn't be back until late the next day. So I packed my things, got ready, and headed out. The trip there was uneventful. Hours of empty roads and quiet highways, just the sound of the truck rumbling beneath me. I unloaded the delivery without any problems and started heading back. But it was late, around 1 in the morning, when I figured I should pull over and rest for an hour or two before continuing. The last sign I saw for a truck stop said 40 miles ahead, so I kept driving. The road was dead, quiet at that hour. Just me, my thoughts, and miles of asphalt stretching ahead. I tend to zone out on long stretches like that, especially at night. But something flickered in my side mirror, snapping me back to reality. I glanced over and saw headlights, right behind my trailer, but I couldn't see the car. It was in my blind spot, too close for me to get a good look. I figured they'd pass me eventually, so I kept my speed steady. But they didn't. Instead, the car stayed right behind me, uncomfortably close. At this point, I was getting irritated. If I had to brake suddenly, they'd slam right into me. The truck stop was only a few miles away, so I tried to ignore it, hoping they'd move on. But as I neared the rest area, the car still lingered. Finally, I saw the sign for the stop and pulled in, figuring they'd drive past, but they didn't. Instead, they followed me into the parking lot. Now this was strange. Maybe I cut them off at some point, and they wanted to confront me about it. Truckers deal with plenty of angry drivers, but I'd never had someone follow me like this. I pulled into a spot, parked the truck, and waited. The car crept closer, inching towards the back of my trailer, but still too close for me to get a clear look at the driver. At this point, something felt off. I got out of the cab and started walking around the truck, ready to confront whoever it was. But the second I slammed the door shut, they threw it into reverse and sped off. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but I caught a glimpse of the car, a white, rusted old sedan with bumper bars like an old police cruiser. Inside was an older man, his face barely visible in the dim light. I stood there for a moment, watching as the car disappeared down the road, then went around to check the back of the truck. Everything seemed secure. I was unsettled, but figured that was the end of it. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and took one last look around before shutting my eyes. About 2 hours later, I jolted awake to a loud bang, echoing from the trailer. I checked my watch. It was just past 3 a.m. Then, another bang, louder this time. I peered into the side mirror and saw a shadow, faint, moving at the rear of the truck. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the small knife I kept in the middle compartment and quietly opened the door, making sure not to make any noise. As I got closer, crouching slightly to stay hidden, I glanced under the trailer. There, standing right against the back of the truck, was someone. I could see their car just behind them, headlights off. A chill ran through me. I stopped dead in my tracks. Without thinking, I shouted, my voice shaky but loud enough to be heard. Whoever it was jumped into the car and sped off into the night. I rushed to the back of the truck and saw deep scratches all over the lock. Whoever it was, they were trying to break in. The thought sent a wave of fear through me. The parking lot was mostly empty, no other trucks around to witness what had just happened. After standing there for a few moments, trying to shake off the nerves, I decided to get back on the road. There was no way I was staying there any longer. The rest of the trip was quiet, but the feeling stayed with me. The paranoia that someone might be following me, just out of sight. Looking back, I'm pretty sure the man just wanted to steal from my trailer. What he didn't know was that I'd already made my delivery. The trailer was completely empty. Still, it's the most unnerving experience I've had during my years on the road. And sometimes, late at night, I can't help but check my mirrors a little more often, just to make sure no one's following. I was at a big concert last year, over in East Detroit. You know how rough it can be, especially around that part of the city. The crime rate is no joke. But the tickets were cheap, and the crowd was massive, so I figured it was safe enough. Plus, I wasn't alone. I went with a couple of friends. The concert, it was amazing. But we knew the drive home was going to be a nightmare with all that traffic. By the time we got out of the parking lot, it was already close to 11 p.m. We finally made it onto the main road, but it was obvious. We weren't getting anywhere anytime soon. Cars were barely crawling forward. Sitting there in traffic, my friends started checking the GPS for other routes. We found one that looked promising, said it would get us around the jam. After sitting in the same spot for nearly 30 minutes, we were all on board. We turned off the main road at the first chance, winding our way through dark, quiet neighborhood streets. What struck us first was the number of people out, just standing around or walking the streets this late. It wasn't like where we lived, which was a good 2 hours north. As we drove, things started to feel off. These people, they were watching us, every step of the way, their eyes following the car as we passed. And then it hit us. We hadn't seen another car for miles. That's when the nerves started kicking in. I asked my friend to check how far we were from the nearest main road, and just as he was scrolling through the map, my other friend spotted something. At the end of the street there was a car, parked sideways, blocking both lanes. I stopped immediately, threw the car in reverse, and backed out. We tried another street, hoping it would lead us somewhere, but it didn't take long before we saw it again. Another car, blocking the road. Panic set in. My friends and I looked at each other, none of us knowing what to do. It was pitch black out, and we couldn't tell if anyone was in the car ahead, but approaching it felt like a mistake. Then, two men appeared out of nowhere, stepping out from one of the houses nearby. One of them stood behind the car, blocking us, while the other came straight toward my window. He signaled for me to roll it down. My heart was racing, but I cracked the window just a few inches. He scanned the car, looking at each of us, then asked, "Where are you headed?" "Just back to the highway," I replied, my voice shaky. He nodded, slowly glanced over to his friend, who was now making his way to the passenger side. For a moment, everything froze like time stood still. Then suddenly, both men lunged at the car, pulling on the doors. My friends screamed. I slammed the car into reverse, but one of them managed to jam his arm through the crack in the window. For a split second, he was stuck, his arm wedged, until I floored it, sending him tumbling to the ground as I sped backwards. I turned the car around and bolted back the way we came. My hands were trembling. We headed straight for the highway, not daring to look back. I don't know what those men wanted, but I'm just glad the doors were locked.